grabar la sesión para que la tengamos, para que después, posteriormente, la podamos ver. Bueno, eh, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a todas y a todos en este espacio. Yo soy Laura Hernández, soy integrante de la Coordinadora Nacional de Mujeres Indígenas, CONAMI. Y bueno, CONAMI, junto con otras redes, organizaciones, activistas, académicos, integramos esto, lo que es la Red Interamericana Antifemicida, ¿no? En ese sentido, desde la red hemos estado haciendo es un esfuerzo colectivo, ¿no? De ir haciendo estos espacios virtuales, ¿no? Donde hemos escuchado distintas experiencias, ¿no? De precisamente sobre el tema de feminicidio y cómo está la situación, ¿no? Tanto en México como en otros países, ¿no? Estados Unidos y bueno, otras experiencias que hemos escuchado de Argentina, ¿no? También. Y bueno, en este sentido, desde este esfuerzo, bueno, pues estamos nuevamente aquí en este espacio virtual, ¿no? Donde, bueno, ahora nos acompañará la compañera Dawn Wilcox, disculpen el inglés. Y bueno, es su semblanza, ustedes la van a ver en inglés, pero yo le daré lectura a la que tengo en la versión en español, ¿no? Por esta cuestión de que no manejo el inglés. Y bueno, daré lectura a su semblanza y después le cederé la palabra a Dawn y bueno, ella nos compartirá su experiencia, ¿no? Con el título de hoy del seminario. Y bueno, después tendremos un pequeño espacio para compartir preguntas o hacer comentarios, ¿no? Bueno, en ese sentido, Dawn Wilcox es sobreviviente de violencia doméstica, es investigadora, activista y educadora en el tema de feminicidios. En 2016, ella fundó un colectivo, por así decirlo, que es Mujeres Cuentan de Estados Unidos, proyecto de contabilidad sobre feminicidios y está creando la primera base de datos integral sobre feminicidios de todas las mujeres y niñas asesinadas por hombres y niños en los Estados Unidos desde 1950 hasta el presente. Dawn también trabaja para desafiar las narrativas de los medios de comunicación que culpan a las víctimas de la violencia doméstica y el feminicidio. Tiene una licenciatura en ciencias en enfermería de la Universidad de Mujeres de Texas y ha sido enfermera registrada durante 26 años. El título de su charla es Mujeres Invisibles, un análisis de la violencia letal contra mujeres en los Estados Unidos. Y bueno, recordarles la interpretación que lo va a estar haciendo Claire. Entonces, van a ver bueno, hasta abajo, ¿no? En el menú del Zoom, en la pantalla del Zoom, hasta abajo el mundito y ahí le pueden seleccionar español para que puedan escuchar, ya que Dawn va a estar hablando en inglés. Y bueno, ya sin más que comentar, deseo la palabra, Dawn. Bienvenida y muchas gracias por estar aquí en este espacio y compartirnos la experiencia que estás llevando a cabo. Gracias.
You want me to share my screen now? Yeah, okay. All right, hold on just a second. I'm so grateful to be here with you all today, and I'm very thankful to be able to share my work with people who care about it. And, you know, Claire, I just realized I'm not sure I'm going to be able to tell when you've stopped interpreting. So hold on just a second. Let me make it so I can see you guys again. So should I just, like continue to talk, but just go slowly? Okay. If I get too fast, just let me know. Okay. And so in 2016, I began to look and do some research to discover if there were any sources of information about the number of women who had been killed in the United States by men at that time in 2016. And I discovered that although there were domestic violence organizations who were tracking women who were killed by current or former intimate partners, I found that there really was no one central location where we were tracking murders of women by men as a whole. And actually, I was pretty shocked to find that out. I think we're all maybe under the impression that someone's doing that in the government somewhere, but I found that that was not the case. And where it is being counted, the information is often very fragmented and missing. And so I just also wanted to talk to you about the Name Women Count USA. Obviously, women count all over the world, but I went to choose the name Women Count, and the name was already chosen by a group that does education about women and voting. So I had to choose another name. And I also wanted to make sure that people understood that I was focusing on the United States, which is necessary because of the scope of, or the sheer number of cases are so many, and also the limitations on my language. I couldn't read Italian newspapers and do that work for Italy or for other countries. And there are women in many other countries who are doing that work themselves, which is the way it should be. So in 2016, I decided I would just start trying to document and count all the cases that I could find, primarily through news articles of women and girls who had been killed. And I quickly discovered the task was overwhelming. And I also discovered that as I did this work, there were many cases from the past that were like cold cases, or I would be researching a case in like 2018, and I would see that in 1980, they just solved a case of a woman who was murdered. So I decided to try to go back to 1950 to try to compile every single case I can find. And obviously that's going to be a lifelong job, and it probably will need to continue even after I'm gone, which is one reason I'm very excited to share my thoughts about the work that I do, how I do the work, and where I find information, and the sorts of pieces of data that I feel are important. And so I have, some public contributors who will send in cases, will go out and research cases, send me batches of cases. And I have had volunteers kind of off and on, not many. Most of the research and documenting has been done by myself. And, it's very difficult and often emotionally taxing work. It's very, very time consuming. And so, people will want to volunteer, but they'll quickly find that it really is not an easy thing to do. It is something I spend about 25 to 30 hours a week on, and on top of a job. And so it can be difficult to get volunteers. And it's very important to me that I'm not just documenting anytime a woman's killed. So I am trying to the best of my ability, based on the information I have available to me, to make sure that the murder fits the definition of a femicide. And the World Health Organization defines that as the murder of women, typically by men, although it can be by other women, because they are women. And it differs from male homicide because it typically involves ongoing abuse, such as with intimate partner relationships, threats, intimidation, sexual assault or violence. And it's situated where women have less power, whether we're talking about in the system of patriarchy or in smaller systems within our society. And I think it's very important to understand that femicide just doesn't happen. It's typically the final fatal act against women, and it occurs on a continuum of misogynistic behaviors. And it starts with our attitudes and our thoughts, and even going back to childhood, where we're implicitly and explicitly given the ideas that girls are less than boys, they're not as smart, they're not as capable. And the whole idea that women are to be controlled by men, the property of men, all of the slurs and dehumanization you see in society, whether it be in film or, on the streets, being harassed, women not being able to feel like they can walk down the street, go to their jobs, or jog, safely in a country where they pay taxes and, where they're supposed to have the, as we put it, the right to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's also present in disparities in the criminal justice system. I think we've all seen cases where women, especially with sexual assault, are treated horribly unfairly, not believed. Many of their cases never proceed to even arrest and being sent to prosecutors. So a lot of that definitely contributes to the sort of continuum we see where women are sort of disregarded. We see it with systemic racism. We see it in the system of domestic violence, and it certainly is a system. I know here in the United States, it's very common to see a news article about a woman's murder, and you'll see the police will state that it's a isolated incident, and the public has nothing to fear. And my thought is that's not an isolated incident. Every murder of a woman by a partner in the United States is part of a larger system. So they certainly are something that the public should worry about. And then going on to, as we talked about, physical assault, the street harassment, and then finally femicide. And so this was just an article that was written about my work in the American Journal of Nursing. And I talked about why it's important to know how big the problem is. And I really approach this sort of from a nursing standpoint, in the sense that that's kind of what I've been trained to be for the last 27 years. So that's how my mind works. And I just realized that, if I had a disease that I was trying to cure or fight or, help patients with, I'd have to know how big it was, who in my patient population it was affecting, how often it was happening, and where it was occurring, why it was occurring, how it was occurring. So those questions are questions that I have about femicide, and we cannot possibly begin to fight male fatal violence against women if we don't know how big it is. And anybody who tells you they know how many women are being killed in the United States by men is misinformed. They don't know. I don't even know. And I'm knee deep in this every day. So it's an answer we need.
The data I collect is open source and I make it available for use
Sorry.
by journalists.
I'm not sure why that's doing that. It's probably in the thing. So anyway, so I collect data with the idea that I want it to be open source so that anybody who might be interested in looking at pieces of data or the data as a whole can do so. So I've been approached by academics, I've been approached by journalists, and while the data is incomplete, it's just really going to be a lifelong mission. As I said, there are patterns that I even have begun to see, and I want that data to at least be collected in one place. So maybe I'm not, maybe it's not like a rigorous academic study, but somebody could go and find the data later, through the links that I have and through what I have collected, and turn that into a more rigorous research project, or, whatever they would want to do with it. And, I've worked with MIT. I was very proud to work with them to help them to create a femicide alert, which would be sort of like a Google alert for women who do work like this. And it would gather news articles about femicide in a way that's much more tailored to what we're looking for and what we need. And I've worked with a professor at John Jay College to and had her students help me to collect data specifically about Black women and other women of color. And then, sometimes there's specialized inquiry that people ask for the information for. And so, if you're doing this work or you're interested in doing this work, I think, ethical considerations are paramount. You need to, examine your motives. Why is it that you are interested in this? I think, this is not a true crime blog. This is not a true crime podcast. This is, I think those can have their place if they're done in a way that is respectful of victims and not sensationalized. But this is like real life. These are real women's lives. It's foremost important to protect their dignity and their humanity, which has often been stripped from them, and to come from a trauma-informed place. You are often dealing with families who you may be approached by to either add cases or their loved ones' names to your database, or to even thank you if they come across your database and they see that their daughter or their mother is included. You have to be very careful about how you present suspects or persons of interest. And there's a distinction there. A person of interest is not a suspect. And so you have to be very careful not to word things on your database in a way that presumes guilt. You have to maintain confidentiality. There are times family members share things with me and they don't want their name shared, or they don't want certain aspects put on the database. You want to build community relationships with other women who do this work, even across the world, as we're doing here, and as I've done with other women. And there's a lot of wonderful women doing very similar work, and I love to learn from them. You want to respect cultural beliefs and practices. There are some, especially Native American, indigenous cultures, that they don't want their loved one's name in a database sometimes. So you have to really be careful about that. You have to treat marginalized communities with respect, and understand that they are already facing kind of double whammies, often of homophobia, transphobia, racism. And you want to highlight the work of others. So, strong women build each other up. Talking about femicide and murdered women is not a competition. It is something that we need more voices, not less. And we want to be sure that we highlight the work of others. So whenever I am doing this work, for example, I mentored a woman who approached me and wanted to do this work and just document Black women, and she created Black Femicide US. And I showed her how I do the work. I showed her where I get information. And anytime I'm invited, like when I was invited to work with MIT, I asked them to include her. So just be sure to use whatever privilege you have to highlight other women, especially in marginalized communities, who are doing this work, because they are the most well-suited person to talk about violence against women in their own communities. I can't speak for Black women. I can speak up on behalf of, but I can't speak for them, and they need that the ability to speak for themselves. Or women in Latinx communities need to be able to speak up for themselves. So don't wait for permission. I didn't wait to have a graduate degree. I have a bachelor's degree, and I wouldn't have time. I've thought about getting a graduate degree, but I can't work full time and do this and go to school. But also at the same time, I don't think you have to be an academic to care about this subject and to do something about it. But you also need to know your limitations and ask for help and consult as experts when it's appropriate. And so how are we counting femicides? And the fact is, we're not counting murders in general very accurately at all. Some of the research I did looking at, the FBI uses the Uniform Crime Report, and unfortunately, police departments are not required to report their homicides to this federal agency for inclusion. And it can be very time consuming for police departments. They may not have the personnel, and they may not understand the value of the data. And there's really not a lot of good data about the relationships between the perpetrator and the victim. So it's hard to really understand what happened and to see trends. And also, the National Crime Victimization Survey doesn't track homicides, and it uses extrapolation. The CDC often has more accurate numbers of homicides in the United States because doctors are mandated reporters. So when they report causes of death to the CDC, they are required to. So an organization called the Murder Accountability Project actually figured out that there were thousands of unreported murders to the federal level, to the FBI. And when they took that data and subtracted it from the CDC's data, the only problem with the CDC data is it's got very complicated search parameters, and the information is de-identified. You can't really tell the relationships. And that's one of the big reasons I stick to news articles, because I can find information that you can't find in government reports. And we have the National Gun Violence Memorial, where most women who are killed with a firearm, and that is the overwhelming cause of death for women in the United States, is a gunshot wound. And there are state domestic violence organizations who have end-of-year reports or memorials. The only problem with that is it's typically just a current or former romantic partner. Some will include, like mother-son relationships and that kind of thing. But in my work, I found that there are many, many other family members who are killing women. I mean, the overwhelming number is going to be current or former partners, but there are also large amounts of other family members. And then the Human Rights Campaign specifically tracks murdered transgender women and non-binary victims. And, of course, unfortunately, those are disproportionately women of color. There are so many gaps in the data. There are a lot of unidentified femicides. So you have mislabeled deaths. I come across cases where it was initially ruled a suicide, or they can't determine cause of death. And typically a lot of those cases are strangulations, because if it's a gunshot wound, or if it's someone is beaten to death, blunt force trauma, or if it is a even sharp force injury, like someone stabbed to death, typically, even if remains are skeletonized, you can see telltale signs of those injuries. And a lot of times when you can't see anything by default, if it is a foul play is suspected and it is most likely a homicide, we're probably talking about strangulation, which, as I'll talk about later, is a uniquely gendered cause of death. And in cold cases, the perpetrator is most likely male. When we find a murdered woman, 99.999% of the time, a man is the perpetrator. And then there's missing victims who are reported, but they've never been found. In some no body cases, we can prosecute, but in many, if you don't have a body, you can't even begin to say that, okay, it's a homicide, and now we need to do an investigation. So we have reported victims who are probably murdered, just never have been found. And then the ones that really haunt me are unreported cases. We don't even know that they're gone. It's occurred to me that I've never heard of any sort of system where we match birth certificates to death certificates. So everybody's born and we get a birth certificate, and when you die, you're supposed to get a death certificate. And after a reasonable number of years, the average lifespan, 90, 100 years, is anybody taking a look at all of these people who were born, but we don't know, we can't account for them, what happened to them. And then missing from the data are ignored femicides, of Indigenous women, women of color. These cases are often not being properly identified, investigated, prosecuted, documented. Same for LGBTQ community members. They're often misgendered, and so they're not going to be counted properly. Marginalized women who are in consensual or forced sex work, who are homeless or shelter insecure, who struggle with substance abuse, or who are homeless and mentally ill and struggling, women who are immigrants or refugees, or women who are formerly involved in the penal system, are all especially vulnerable and also not counted properly. So if you look at missing and murdered Indigenous women, 1 in 3 are sexually assaulted, and many of those cases are by non-Native men. They are murdered at 10 times the national rate, and 3 in 5 of them will experience domestic violence. Then African American women are victimized at a much higher rate. They suffer from higher rates of all forms of violence. Almost half have experienced rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner in their lifetime. And they comprise about 40% of confirmed sex trafficking survivors, higher rates of sexual assault than white, Asian, and Latina girls and women. And they're 2.5 times more likely to be murdered by men than white women, which is borne out by my data. And in most of those cases, they are overwhelmingly killed with firearms. They also suffer misogyny combined with racism. They're more likely to be criminalized for defending themselves. If you can imagine being fearful to call the police, who were supposed to call for help, because you're afraid that either you or your partner, that maybe you want them to stop hurting you, but you don't want the police to kill them. That you yourself are at risk for violence at the hands of police, and you're less likely to seek assistance due to a lack of culturally appropriate care, or you've suffered previous discrimination. And they also, women I've talked to don't want to be involved with the state because they're more likely to have their children taken away. I've had the question many times, kind of what about men? In other words, it matters when men are killed too. So why should we care? Why should we count women's murders separately? Aren't we already counting them? It's called homicide. And my argument is that women's murders typically look very, very different than men's. Of course, women suffer from murders that are just completely motivated by like robbery, or in drive-by shootings where they're not specifically targeted, or in mass shootings where they might not be specifically targeted. Although I will say that if there's a mass shooting, I do pay attention to the number of women who are victims versus men, because sometimes if you see a large disproportionate number, that was actually a target attack against women. In women's murders, I see crime scene staging. Domestic violence murders have some of the highest rates of crime scene staging, where the perpetrator will either add or take away evidence to mislead police, staging women's deaths as hanging suicides, as that she committed suicide with a gun, all of those kind of things, or using a just the way that they talk about what happened. The historians get to kind of tell the narrative of what happened, and men who murder women control the narrative of what happened. So they may say things like, oh, she came at me with a kitchen knife, or she asked me to shoot her because she was suffering from cancer, and things that can't really be verified because the other person's dead. So they can't speak up for themselves anymore. Sexual assault murders, at usually the hand of strangers, but also men who are known to women, men they know and trust, even partners. And then overkill is present in many women's murders, where an effort is made not only to kill the woman, but to almost obliterate her, to make it like she never existed. These murders are often especially brutal and vicious, with multiple injuries. It's not unusual to see women with, dozens and dozens of stab wounds, or who are shot multiple times or beaten beyond recognition. And also the use of non-state torture. So I, definitely document cases of women who are waterboarded, who are under camera surveillance in their own homes. I documented a case of a woman who was not allowed to use the restroom unless she called her partner and asked permission. And he made her sit on the couch all day where he could monitor her from work on a camera. So these are things that you just would not even imagine happen in the United States. And so when we look at who is killing women, if you look at this kind of inner circle, the lion's share is going to be current or former intimate partners. And then if you look at it kind of as a concentric circle going outward, the men that are closest to women here, and then into family members, friends and acquaintances, coworkers, neighbors, roommates, and then strangers. And then, we have these categories that we talked about earlier, where we have known missing women who are presumed dead and there are no body cases. They're not reported missing. And, they're misgendered or ignored because, as we've seen with the missing white woman syndrome, they're not blonde and conventionally attractive, or they're women of color and have not had appropriate attention to their cases. And that is the lion's share of cases where we do know who the perpetrator is. And then the missing that we talked about. And those are the women that we don't even know that they're gone. We'll find a body from the 1980s. They'll finally identify it through genetic genealogy or DNA, and family members will say, oh, we thought they just left. It's not unusual, as a matter of fact, to see in cases, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where the husband said, oh, she just left, and no one looked into it. So the children were left with this idea that their mother just abandoned them, didn't care about them, when she was actually murdered by the father and buried in the backyard. So that is not an unusual thing to see. And when you look at the relationship of the perpetrator to the woman, and I'm sorry, this is in the way a little bit. I did an analysis of the largest database I have, which is 2018. I had 1,838 cases documented, and that is not all of the cases from 2018. I am still working on that. I could probably add another 400 or 500 today if I had the ability to do that. So we do see that the larger amount is by a current partner than a former partner. And, but if you look at other relationships, if you look at the things like neighbors and landlords and coworkers, that's pretty close to a former partner. So that's a significant number, as is a male relative. And so we're so concentrated on this. And I know that is a large percentage, but we often don't talk about these categories over here of other men that women know and trust. And then in these cases, sometimes it's not known or it's not released. And then if you look at the relationship of the perpetrator to the woman, a boyfriend, let me see here. I think there's one more at the top. Hold on just a second. Let me see if I can slide this over. I apologize. So I think that up the very top, okay, husband, current, and that was the highest number, then current boyfriend or fiance. And then if you look at ex-boyfriend or fiance, that was next, and then unknown or unreleased. So, you have to look at that and see, well, how many of those were strangers? Because if it's known, if it is an intimate partner, then that information is going to be readily available. So in a lot of these cases, it's very possible that they were strangers, acquaintances and friends. And then if you look at sons and grandsons killed 116 women in 2018. Estranged husbands, fathers killed 87 daughters in 2018. And then, if you just look at strangers, and that is a low overall number. And we typically worry about what is least likely to happen. We're more likely to be killed by a man we trust who's in our own home. But it's still very bizarre to me that how women are just targeted for violence, just kind of randomly. I've often said, if you and I went walking in the jungle and, we know that tigers are dangerous. If we see a tiger, we're going to get the heck out of there. But the problem is for women, we are navigating half of the population on a daily basis in every aspect of our lives, our personal lives, work, going to the gym, going to the grocery store, not knowing which man would harm us, because you can't tell by looking. That's the problem. So if you think about the energy that women and girls expend to try to navigate their daily spaces and stay safe, it's just mind-boggling. And then we have, roommates, neighbors, landlords, tenants, women who are killed just because they live down the street from somebody. So there's a lot of additional, stranger relationships here that I'd be interested to kind of look at further. Then when you look at how women are killed, and again, I'm so sorry this is in the way, firearms are the overwhelming cause of death. We've got 1,108. And then sharp force injury comes in second. Asphyxiation Asphyxiation is another large amount of cases, especially if you look at what I call asphyxiation plus. That's where typically a man will try to strangle a woman, and then they discover that it's not easy to strangle someone, and then they stab them to death or they shoot them. Blunt force trauma, which is beatings, bludgeoning. But, in the United States, we had 7 women set on fire as a cause of death. And there are probably more than that. That's just on my list. Women who are decapitated as a cause of death. And these are things that we just think happen in other countries, but they're happening right here in the United States. So when you think about when are women killed, we often say, why doesn't she just leave? He's been abusive to her, she should just leave. Well, 75% of women either are planning to leave and he knows about it, or have left the relationship when he chooses to murder them. And then we have cases of, so-called what I call mercy killings. They're almost exclusively perpetrated by men, and they're often framed as, the loving acts of husbands, for terminally ill wives. But the problem with that, and the research shows us that there's never any evidence that the woman agreed to this, that there's never any investigation about, was there a prior history of domestic violence, and so even if a victim is disabled or elderly, they still deserve a appropriate and robust investigation of their murder. It's still a murder, and then it overlaps with where, women are killed while they're jogging, while they're working, while they're navigating life in public spaces. And going on to where I've often said that, women are killed at their kids' birthday parties. When you look at the murders of men, typically it's going to be something like, they're murdered during the commission of other criminal activity or gang violence, or they've gotten into a bar fight with another guy and somebody hits somebody too hard and kills them. Women are killed because they have the audacity to want to end a relationship or not enter a relationship, or they say no to sex, or he doesn't like what she wore, or she disrespected my parents, or, she said no to, really anything that you can imagine. And he decided he can be her executioner. And unfortunately, I see not a large number, most women are killed in their homes, but an increasing number of women who are killed at work. If you are a victim of domestic violence, you can go to a shelter. You can, try to hide where you live, but you can't hide where you go to work, where you go to school. You have very little control over the security of your workplace. People can just walk in. And often in these situations where men come in and kill women at work, you see that they'll also kill perceived helpers, other people in their job that they feel were sympathetic to the victim. And then, women are literally killed asleep in bed, in the shower, in their hospital beds, in their retirement homes. So if you look at some of the major reasons why, some of the more obvious reasons would be, we hear men from their own mouths, they didn't want to have to pay child support. They didn't want the cost of a divorce and having to split up property. Although I often feel like there's probably way more to it than that. At the root is that these women are really seen as property and as disposable. Just like, if I'm getting a new car, I just get rid of the old one, sort of thinking, by any means necessary. And then, as I alluded to in the last slide, what I've called, and I created and coined the term corrective femicide. And what I mean by that is when men think they have the right to kill women for perceived wrongs, or for, not dressing the right way, not behaving the right way. And it is an action that kind of serves to keep sort of all women in line, just as, not all women are sexually assaulted, many are, but the fact that we could be sexually assaulted kind of keeps us all from doing certain activities in certain places at certain times. And so and then also sexual assault, murder, serial killers for revenge. And the revenge typically overlaps with how dare you leave me? If I can't have you, nobody will. And then just plain old misogyny. If we listen to men, they'll often let us know their hatred for women. I've heard tapes of women being killed, and he's calling her a bitch, a whore, excuse the language, misogynistic slurs as he's killing her. And so there's a lot of focus on domestic violence and intimate partner violence in femicide, because that is the large number of cases. But I see some overlaps with domestic violence and serial killers. And I also think there's a larger kind of commentary on how we dehumanize women and how we devalue women. And so I'm just talking about two different major serial killers in the United States. This is Samuel Little, who recently died a couple years ago, and he is thought to be the most prolific serial killer in the United States. I think he's admitted to about 93 women that he killed. Many of those women just heartbreakingly were already just so marginalized. Many were sex workers, homeless, women of color, Black women, and very vulnerable. So that just compounds how heartbreaking the situation is. And this is Gary Leon Ridgway. And, I don't like monikers, serial killer monikers, because I think they're very damaging. I think they really serve to elevate these men to kind of star status. And these are not monsters. I'm very clear about that. These are men, because if we make them monsters, then they're these mythical creatures. Nobody can stop them. Nobody could have done anything, So I think I really steer away from using language like he was a monster. This is a man was capable of doing all of these things. And I think it's very important that we don't fall into the trap of using language that mythologizes these men as if it was just their nature and they couldn't help this. So between these two men alone, they strangled to death, confessed to strangling to death 164 women between them. And I made this, when I made this for something, I was doing a presentation, and just what struck me is, if you think about, what if there were two men who had killed 71 convenience store clerks or 93 doctors and lawyers? This teaches us that women are expendable. There's no marginalized group I can think of that if one person killed 71 or 93 people within that group, that there would not be an emergency, response. Something would happen. But these men just killed and killed and killed again, and often were left loose to kill again. And so killing women and dead women are, and I'm going to move this down, I think, to the bottom. So killing women and dead women are entertainment. We see it everywhere. Their bodies are used as entertainment. Often sexualized bodies are used for entertainment, which is extremely disturbing. Killing women and dead women are sexualized and portrayed in sexualized way. They're nameless props in their own murders. So we all can probably name this gentleman, or I'm not gentleman, this man on the left. This is Ted Bundy. But very few of us, including myself, and I do this work, and mostly it's because I have just so many names in my head, can name all of these women. I can name some of these women, but very few of us can name them. There's been no documentaries made about just their lives that I know of, but, we have just, show after show glorifying him and focusing on him. And then women are whores who deserve death. This is Jillian Lauren, who was a journalist who spoke with Samuel Little at length and wrote a book about it. And he really saw the women he killed as nothing because they were sex workers. And not all of them were, but many of them were. And then women are Madonnas or whores, as we talked about, and they're not real people. So just as dangerous as the dehumanizing women as just whores is putting them on a pedestal, where they're not real people entitled to make real decisions for themselves. This is another form of dehumanization on the opposite spectrum. And then that murdered women, in fact, all women are objects and male possessions. And Samuel Little, is quoted here, I picked up whores, I picked up bitches. They're not women of position. And Jillian Lauren said, do you think that those hoes deserve to be dead? And he said, yeah, a lot of women look at me like I'm shit and I couldn't have them. But when I killed them, they're mine for life anyway. And these are actually works of art that Samuel Little did of women that he killed for the purpose of trying to identify them when he confessed, so that at least they'd have some sort of picture of these women. They have identified many of these women. But he really did see himself as a collector of dead women, of women that he killed. So this carries over to this idea with domestic violence abusers who kill women, that you're mine, and if I can't have you, no one else will. And that women owe, the attitude that women owe men sex, that's an attitude we see among regular men, not just serial killers, and that murder is an acceptable response to rejection. I see that all the time. Another thing that I do is to point out problematic reporting in newspapers. And it's not uncommon to see language such as woman rebuffed man who killed her. And if you look up rebuffed, it's to like cast aside cruelly, and to frame a woman's right to say, no, I don't want to go on a date with you as something that's cruel is problematic in itself. So the way that we report these murders are often also a problem. And that women are worthless, whether it's a serial killer like Sam Little or a serial domestic violence murderer. We have men who have killed 2 and 3 wives. Sam Little went undetected for decades because he chose women that he knew no one cared about. And this is something I've talked about lots of times, that these guys aren't necessarily geniuses. What they are is really aware of the way that we see the women he chooses to kill. Nobody's going to look for them. Nobody's going to care about it. As he said, I never killed no senators or governors or fancy New York journalists, nothing like that. He told the New York Times, I stayed in the ghettos.
Sam Little had decades of interactions with police, but only did.
Some of these had like a recorded thing I had done. And so many of these were missed homicides. And that's the case with even domestic violence femicides. When you see cases of men who have repeatedly killed women, often you'll have a husband or a boyfriend and he's killed 2 or 3 women, and they don't catch him until the second or third time. And only when they catch him the second or third time do they go back and look at past murders and say, oh my gosh, his first wife died, his second wife died, and discover that, indeed this is, a serial killer of their romantic partners. And so, you know, when we look at the bumbling inadequacy it takes to miss some of these cases, you know, this Daisy Ann McGuire was one of Samuel Little's victims. Her face was beaten beyond recognition. And they said that she passed away from hypothermia. That was the coroner's decision, was that it was hypothermia. And the sheriff said there was no foul play, but her jaw was broken. Her nose was broken. And years later, and that was in 96 that she was killed. And finally in 2018, Sam Little confessed. So you just look at cases like this and it's, and I won't go too far into this, but it's a very complicated bunch of problems that contribute to how something like this can happen. If you look at how our coroner system works, you know, not everybody gets a medical examiner, a pathologist with advanced training. I mean, in some small podunk towns, the coroner can be a sheriff with no medical training whatsoever. I've heard of hairdressers being the elected coroner. And so, you know, when you have a coroner who shows up to a scene of a dead body, and just from looking at the scene and the any external injuries on the body, they're the ones who have to say, yeah, they need to go for autopsy. Something's not right here. If they don't even do that, then we end up with, you know, cases that, you know, the person's just cremated, the perpetrator's never caught, or even, you know, I've heard of cases where it was the funeral director who finally found evidence that it was a murder and caught it, you know, with somebody's got a broken neck or somebody's got some injuries that there's no way it could have happened in the way that it was said to have happened. So this is Daisy Ann. And that is something that I do on my database that's very important to me. Is I think it's first and foremost important to remember that these were women who had lives and dreams and hope. They weren't just somebody's wife, sister, mother. You know, I have this thing that I found somewhere once that says she was someone's wife, sister, mother, and everything's crossed out and it just says she was someone. You don't have to be someone's wife, sister, or mother to matter. And Daisy, unfortunately, had already been victimized by someone and sexually assaulted. And she, because of that trauma, turned to drugs and was especially vulnerable. And so these are just cases that I've looked at with asphyxiation, you know, and also continued or repeat assaults of women. This man had already stabbed a woman in the throat. In the past, he strangled Jessica Flood during consensual sex. And she loved baseball, softball, gymnastics, had a great smile, as you can see. She was killed during consensual sex. And, you know, this is something that's been outlawed. This defense has been outlawed in the UK. So we have something that has been used very successfully to get away with murder. And that is what we call the rough sex defense, or the shades of gray defense. She wanted it. Yeah, I strangled her to death, but she wanted it. And we haven't come that far in the US, unfortunately. She loved animals and had a great laugh. And then, you know, Virginia Barbour is someone I include because I've been very shocked to find the number of elderly women who are victimized, and often by men who are neighbors, who are in their periphery, who are servicemen or gardeners. And like in this case, her home was burglarized. She was raped, but sometimes when a woman is killed during a burglary, that is still a femicide, because burglary is, believe it or not, like often a sexualized crime. It can be kind of a precursor leading up to raping and murdering women in their homes. So men will typically, you know, start breaking in. then maybe they'll break in and steal underwear or just be in the person's home. They're kind of pushing boundaries, and then, that's not exciting enough. And then, they're just kind of fantasizing and working their way up to raping and murdering a woman. It's not uncommon in my research to see women report or family members report that prior to a woman being raped and murdered in her own home during kind of a burglary, that she noticed that the home had been broken into before, and in a period of time kind of before that, like 2 weeks before that, somebody had been in the house. So that's something that I see. And she was a painter, and she was an art director, taught Sunday school. Sweet woman. You see these women that are in their 80s or 90s, they survived breast cancer, they lived through the Depression, only to be raped and murdered when they're 87 years old. When you think, surely that's not going to happen to me at that age. And this guy tried to use the rough sex defense against a young lady named Dorinda Ma. It was his girlfriend. And, she just had severe injuries. And it's just shameful that defense attorneys even try to use this sort of defense. And she taught English, and she was very loved and respected by her students. This case haunts me. It's one of the worst I've ever heard of. She was killed by her husband. She'd only been married to him for a year. And that is one piece of data that I do track, is how long they've been married. There are women literally who are killed on their honeymoon and on their 50th anniversary. So I do kind of try to track, if I can find that information, how long the relationship was. But her partially decomposed body was found nude on her bed. He had restrained her, handcuffed and zip tied her wrists to her knees. He placed multiple black plastic bags over her head, cinched them, and he wrapped duct tape around her face. And he wrote the word strumpet on the wall above her body. And I looked it up, and that means like a loose woman. So again, this is a form of corrective femicide. And firstly, men like this typically will think a woman's cheating on them, and, it's kind of projection, in a lot of cases, the women aren't even cheating on them. But even if a woman's cheating on a man, this idea that I have the right to execute her for this, if men were executed for infidelity, we would obviously have a huge uproar.
Can you hear?
It was so bad, that it was so horrific what happened to her, that the police officers needed counseling. And I have not been able to find any information on her life at all. I've looked and looked, not a quote from a family member, nothing. Not an obituary. I might have found an obituary, but it didn't say anything. But so she is one person who really stays with me, that her case really haunts me. And so I'm almost at the end here, but above all else, just remember to humanize murdered women and girls. And even, let's not wait to then, let's humanize all women and girls, but especially women and girls who no longer have their voice, no longer have agency over their stories, over what happens to their stories. They're not entertainment. And something I've been doing that really means a lot to me emotionally is, it occurred to me that many of the photos I find of women are probably the last photos that will ever be available of them. They are passed and shared over and over on the internet, on blogs and various media sources. And either the picture originally was of poor quality, or they degrade over time. And so I have begun restoring pictures of women. And this is something that I think is very important, because it humanizes them. And when you can see that they're not just some faded photograph, that they had, a beautiful smile or a twinkle in their eyes, or, beautiful brown eyes, or it just really helps to remind us that these are real women. What happened to them, what was done to them, not happened, what was done to them through the actions of men. is heartbreaking. They're irreplaceable. They were loved. They mattered. Every Mother's Day, every Christmas, every birthday, every anniversary of their murder, every time the family has to go and sit before a parole board and plead to not have a murderer released back into the community. There are people who hopefully, are around to still mourn for them. So, we can I can take pictures and just try to make them a little bit better. Like for instance, this young lady was killed by Gary Ridgway, who is also called the Green River Killer. And again, I don't like those monikers, but sometimes that's all people know them by. But you can just see what a difference this makes. We have a very faded black and white photograph, and there we just, have this beautiful smile of this lovely young lady who lost her life unnecessarily. And the women and girls that I document range in age from infants all the way up to their 90s, every ethnicity, religious belief, social class, economic class. And so you can just see, the difference, how their faces and their eyes come to life. And it's just my way of just showing people kind of who they really were through the kind of fog of time and pulling that back. And some of these are even recent pictures, but some are very old. Some of these women were sex workers, or were forced into positions where they were in commercial sexual exploitation. And the only photo that exists of them is a mugshot, which is heartbreaking. But that's the only photo we have. So I at least tried to improve that. But you can see, I think, and this one's kind of heartbreaking. You can see with Gail Lynn Matthews, Gary Ridgway also killed her. You almost see tears in her eyes a little bit when that was a mugshot that was taken. And many of these women, especially who are in sex work and who are especially vulnerable, they have already faced so many hardships. Many of these women were sexually abused at home, and they ran away because they were being sexually abused at home. Excuse me. But you can just see, what a difference. So this is something I also do that means a lot to me. So they're not perfect. I don't have like Photoshop or anything like that, but I try to at least make the photos better and restore some of their humanity. And so this is just something I wrote when I was thinking about femicide and violence against women. And, I just said that it's a profound human rights violation, an epidemic, and a public health crisis. Femicide occurs on a continuum, and it's the most extreme form of that violence. When we describe men as just snapping while they meticulously premeditate women's murders or accept arguments or drunkenness or breakups as, quote, reasons men kill their partners, we fail to recognize that murder is often his final act of many acts of abuse and control. Women deserve to have their lives valued. They deserve our voices speaking out on their behalf. And when they are abused, assaulted, murdered, and erased, they deserve our attention and our outrage. And my work is about using documentation and data to affect change and to help us remember these women were not merely statistics, so they aren't forgotten. And so the last thing I just wanted to show you is just kind of what my database looks like. For instance, this is just 2021 and it's not nearly finished, but this is, I use Airtable. I did use Google Sheets, but I was terrified that something would go wrong and I wouldn't be able to talk to a real person or have any way to restore data. And I love I love Airtable because I can manipulate the data in a lot of ways and look at things. You know, so the kind of data I collect is just sort of a synopsis of what happened, the date. And what is that date? Is that the date her body was found? Is that the date she was killed? Is that the date she was missing? And then, and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And then, whoops, hold on just a second. You know, her photo, it's very important to me to include a photo of each woman if I can find one, her age, her race or ethnicity, something about her. She liked to cook. She had a funny laugh. She was a pain in the rear end, whatever. Just, you know, something about each woman is very important to me. The city, the state, the relationship of the perpetrator. And I do kind of try to sort of group relationships together. In other words, like a brother, a stepbrother, partner or siblings brother. So, you know, a son would be with a son-in-law and all that kind of thing. And then in the column next to that, I, you know, will put specifics. So this says father, stepfather, mother's boyfriend. And I wrote that it's a father, their name, their picture. And one thing I want to say about including pictures of the men here, many of the pictures I have are mugshots, but it's very important. I think I try to find a normal picture of the guy. And the reason is, I think when you have a mugshot, people look at that and they say, well, of course he killed her. Look at him. He looks like a criminal, or he looks like a bad person. And I think that's very unfair to that woman, because that's not the person she fell in love with. That's not the person she saw that she let into her life, let into her children's life. It's this guy, you know, the smiling guy. So I think it is very important to include pictures of the men, because ultimately, you know, the responsibility with violence against women is with men. And so when they're absent from the conversation, they're absent from the databases, it isn't respectful to the victims. It actually makes it seem like there's just some phantom or vapor or unknowable entity that's killing them, not Gary Jensen, her smiling husband. So I think it's very important to include that information. I also include his occupation if I can find that out. I'm especially interested in if they're in law enforcement or the military, how they were killed, you know, if it was a gunshot wound. I have some major categories here. And then, you know, I kind of break it down in the next column to, you know, if they were shot in the head, which is, you know, obviously meant to be fatal, if they were abducted, if they're beaten with what, if their body was buried and found like in the backyard or found somewhere else, if, you know, all these different kind of behavior